is your foxy writer, Brandy Ackerley, coming to you today with Chapter 9 of my first novel, Hunter's Gambit. I am having an absolutely great week. The sun has been shining, the wind has been blowing, and I'm finally done. My novel just needs me to run it through a grammar check and such, and then it will be ready to send to my beta readers and editors. I am going to have a full celebration when I'm done. Oh, so expect that. Either this Friday or maybe during Chapter 10 next week. Either way, I can't wait to celebrate with all of you. Now, last week in Chapter 8, Kazunaha went to the koi for a drink, hoping to see Richard again. She was lucky, and not only was he there, but he was feeling well enough to come down to the main room. While they talked, he proposed a business venture with Kazunaha. It turns out that Richard had not come to Hidan just for some lazy sightseeing. He's got a map and is looking for treasure. He was hoping to get a local to help him, and Kazunaha was more than willing, especially after her sister expressly forbade it. Now, on with the show! Okay, now I'm just going to pull the book up here. There we go. Richard looked at the house again. It was big, a lot bigger than he thought a noble's house would be in a two-horse town. It was also pretty. Expensive materials, kept up, new coats of paint when the old got ratty. It was too good. If the inside looked anywhere near as nice as the outside, he may just have gotten in over his head. Kala had been available and eager, but comparing her to Kuzu would be like comparing a candle flame to a campfire. He'd thought that she was his goddess come to ground when he first saw her, though he'd never heard of Pristinel taking the form of a Sienku woman before. After realizing that Kazunaha was only a conduit, one that the goddess had worked through, but still just mortal, he still wanted to know her better. All of her. Richard was attractive, but he wasn't the sort who would normally interest a woman like her. He'd hoped to woo her into bed with his money, his charm, his mysteriousness. He looked at the house again. Money was not going to work. He mentally revised how much he'd hoped to offer her, and sighed. If she had a mind for business at all, hiring her was going to be expensive in and of itself. He let out a breath. Just how far was he willing to go to sleep with her? She was gorgeous, like a doll dressed in silk, even if she was shorter than any grown woman he'd ever known. Her height hadn't stopped her from killing someone to save his life. A goddess coming out of the dark, doing everything she could to help him. From the information he'd dug up since his return, no one had found the boat yet. If it did lead to some sort of treasure, he might be able to afford a ship for the next part of his route. He might even have enough extra to cloud his passage, further confusing any of his pursuers. He shivered. He hadn't been able to figure out what his attackers had done in town after they'd gotten here. He needed to get out, but he needed money and information first. Mice would flee without thought or plan when spooked. Lions planned, hunted, and most importantly, survived. The entire situation was too perfect for him to ignore. Fated. He knocked. A pretty woman, Sienku like Kazunaha, answered the door. Her clothing was sky blue, a robe design that fell to her ankles, leaving her shoulders bare. The robe did have sleeves, long enough to just cover the girl's slender fingers. 2 green ribbons dangled from the top of the sleeve, presumably to tie them out of the way while cleaning. She was cute, in that same foreign way that Kuzu was, though not attractive enough herself to be a conduit. He smiled at her, raising his eyebrows suggestively. She blushed and glanced away. "What do you need, sir? The mistress of the house is already gone this morning." "Actually, I was looking for the younger mistress." The girl gave a little bow before ushering him into a house that appeared even nicer on the inside than it did on the outside. The walls were wooden for the most part, separated by the same paper room dividers he'd seen in the bathing house. The floor and furniture had been stained a deep nutmeg brown. Here and there, Red accents gleamed, reminding him of tiny petals floating on the wind. Soft-looking pillows, dyed in vibrant colors too bright to have been washed much, had been placed on a few of the couches. When he'd been working as a thief in Giza, this place would have been above his pay grade, because they would have been paying for protection. In that city, it was just easier. The girl stopped at a small table at the entry to the living room and gestured for him to sit in the small chair beside it. "I'll make my mistress for you." She isn't awake yet? It was nearly mid-morning. He wondered how late she usually slept. No. The girl couldn't meet his eyes. There was something about shy women like her. Adorable. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maya, sir." She swallowed, and her chest heaved. "I'm Richard, a follower of Christinelle. I don't suppose you worship her here, do you?" Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. The words worked for most women who hadn't been brought up on the island of Kaleka. There was a vast difference between sex and worship, but these people didn't know that. They heard that the goddess was a courtesan, and that her adherents were known for their sexual virility. It was a stereotype that worked in his favor at times like these. He stepped closer to the maid and brought her hand up to his lips, kissing it. "I'd love to introduce you to her worship sometime." "Sir!" An older woman's voice interrupted him, and he looked up. The glaring woman was no taller than Kazunaha, about 30 years older and wider than some of the doorways he'd seen here. As a rule, Richard liked women. This one he could do without. "If you're looking for women like that, you should go to the bathing house, Arise from Ashes. Maya, you should know better." Maya's cheeks were pink, and it wasn't entirely out of embarrassment. "Sorry, sir." She pulled away, still gasping like a fish on a hook. "I'm not," he whispered. The flush consumed her face, and she nearly fled up the stairs. "I'm going to go and find my mistress for you." "Follow me to the dining room, scoundrel," the crone said. "I am sorry. It won't happen again." "Where she could find them," he amended silently. She pointed to a seat at a simple black table set, with flowers arranged in a low vase. He sat, but she didn't move, staring at him from behind one of the other chairs. "Thank you. I'll sit here and wait for your mistress." When she still didn't move, he returned the stare until she grumbled and walked out of the room. The ship, sight to see, wouldn't be too difficult to find. Or at least not any more difficult than any other ship that had been missing for half a century or more. She'd been carrying a coin box of a rather impressive size, and the notes, though disjointed, would be enough to help him narrow down an area. A glass clinked in front of him. Maya smiled, and he picked it up and took a sip of the dark maroon fluid in it. Not wine, or any sort of alcohol. It had a light, fruity taste, like raspberry and blackberry, but something else too that he couldn't identify. A tang that he didn't associate with either fruit. Fruit juice, rather than a morning wine, but he'd never tasted juice so smooth before. There wasn't a smidgen of pulp in the glass. He'd never seen anything this clear, other than a good white wine or the waters in Diver's Cove. He sighed. If Kuzu's servants wrung out her juices in cheesecloth before they even made it to the table, then he'd have to rethink how much he hoped to offer her of the treasure. He'd originally intended to offer her money up front and a small percentage of the treasure. Now he might have to offer her a full share. He supposed that in that case there was some benefit. If he found nothing, he wouldn't be down to coppers. "Thank you, Maya. How long will your mistress be?" Her breath caught, and she glanced around nervously. "Sir, I can't." "Of course not," he said, hiding a smile. He hadn't meant to put across that sort of request. "Please, call me Richard. I wanted to apologize for my forwardness. You are lovely, and I wasn't mentioning it before we gotten to know each other. If you would like to see me, I'll be staying at the Lucky Koi for the next few weeks." She glanced away, but her eyes came back to his, as if drawn. She nodded, and he watched her hips sway as she left. Kazunaha arrived soon after the meal was set on the table. She looked half asleep, her long hair drooping around her. Even tired, she stopped in front of a tiny shrine tucked into the corner. She clapped loudly, bowing slightly, and then moved her hands to form a symbol, some sort of triangle with her fingers. Then she came to sit down at the table. "Good morning," he said. She grumped as she collapsed into the chair. "Is it? I haven't been awake long enough to know." Not a morning person, apparently. Even just up from bed, she was beautiful. It was her lips he noticed the most. She'd been wearing lipstick the color of cinnamon at the Lucky Koi that night, a week ago. Her natural color was a lovely maroon pink. Maya slipped a plate of food in front of Kazunaha, with an addition Richard hadn't had. Pancakes. A small glass jar of honey accompanied it. She slathered the thin cakes with butter, and then opened the jar. He could smell it, and his breath caught. Not honey. Maple syrup. A memory he hadn't thought of in years returned. Maple syrup overpowered the rosemary and garlic his mother hung in the kitchen, and his mother's face, unlined, cooing at him. A good memory. Without a thought, she drizzled the syrup all over the pancakes and closed the jar again. "May I try some?" Richard asked. Maple trees only grew in a few places, and it was stupidly expensive anywhere else. Hedan wasn't one of those places. A jar that size was an investment of gold, not copper or even silver. She blinked at him, looked down at his plate, and shot Maya a look. "Make him a set, now!" "Mistress, your sister said—" "I invited him, and you will treat him with every courtesy." "Yes, mistress." She stole one last glance and then fled into the kitchen. "Your sister disapproves of me that much?" Richard asked. She rolled her eyes and took a bite of the pancakes, maple syrup dripping wasted onto the plate below. "Yes, but that isn't what Maya meant. Maple syrup is expensive, so we don't generally have it when others are here. However, my sister had some this morning. I'm not missing out, and neither are you. After all, technically you are a business acquaintance, and Father used to make sure it was offered whenever we hosted them. Besides, it's Himiko's favorite, so she makes sure she always has some available. She's less diligent in getting the things I enjoy." Kazunaha cut off another slice and put it in her mouth. He didn't mind reaping the benefits of sibling rivalry when they included things like maple syrup. "And so we are going to be associates. I'm glad," he said. "It appeared as though you may have only agreed because your sister forbade it." Kazunaha picked at her food. "I won't back out. Himiko, she thinks that this is below me. My father believed that no child of his should be working for someone of a lower status than our family. This leaves me precious few places to go. My father was quite well loved." She sounded sour when she said the last, and he didn't respond. A moment later, Maya walked in and slid a plate of 3 pancakes in front of him. He caught her eye before she could turn away. "Thank you. I appreciate it," he told her. Her smile made her entire face light up. She turned and strode into the kitchen. Once she was gone, he slathered the pancakes with butter before drizzling syrup over them. "What businesses do your family run?" he asked, putting the fork into his mouth. The syrup was sweet as candy, with a hint of smokiness. He could have melted into a puddle right then. Not that the rest of the food wasn't good, but this was a luxury few ever had. He took another bite, as if he needed to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Kazunaha was cocking an amused smile at him, as if he were overreacting for her benefit. girl, this slip of a girl in this slip of a village, ate them every week or so. To her, they were no big deal. She sipped her juice, as peerless and devoid of pulp as his own. Dyed silk and glass. Richard sighed. It didn't matter how small the town was. With those two industries supporting it, they would have more access to the essentials than some larger cities did. Or at least her family always would. Asking why she wouldn't want to do the work she was trained for was probably too forward. He hesitated, and then asked anyway. What were you trained to do? She put down her fork, and her eyes turned away, and she grumbled. My sister's replacement. Richard nearly choked. That would leave her with nothing unless her sister was willing to give one of the companies to her. He didn't know much about her sister, but he didn't think she would give up any of her control easily. Your father didn't provide you with any additional training? No. He learned early that by pitting us against each other, he got better production out of us. It was good for Himiko, but for me... She shook her head. That's why I want this to work. Let's discuss our arrangement then. How much will you want for being a guide? We won't be splitting the prize? 50-50? It's my book, my treasure. I had thought to offer you gold rather than a cut. It's a safer investment than a percentage. He couldn't help but try, even knowing the tactic was likely doomed to fail. I don't want safe. I want to be your partner, not your employee. He smiled, but covered it up with a sip of juice. Maybe she didn't want the detriments of being a noble, but she wasn't completely willing to give up the perks either. Before, he'd wanted to have her in his bed. Now he wanted to know her as well. 35%? She raised an eyebrow. You're bringing the book and the survival skills, but I'm not completely unknowledgeable myself, or you wouldn't be hiring me. 40%. He expected her to go higher, which was why he'd started low. That she wasn't being greedy meant he'd read her right. She was professional, but even inexperienced, she wouldn't end up being a liability on the road. With the addendum that if I choose payment in something other than coins, it will take priority, she added. As in jewelry and such? You would accept trade rather than money? Yes. Speaking of which, what do we know about this ship? Richard smiled. Here's what I know. The ship was called Sight to Sea. Her captain was known for taking illegal cargo on occasion. Despite that, she did some passenger travel as well. On her last voyage, one of her stops was supposed to be Dan, but she never made it. I don't know much about her cargo, but I know that she was carrying some rich man from Helvetica, delivering gifts and money somewhere. And it's thought that this ship crashed somewhere near Hidan? I found a book that had information on it. Apparently they were hit by a storm and there was only one survivor. The man was raving mad and sent to live with a nephew in a nearby town. The man's grandson wrote about his stories that he heard from his great-uncle. And you think we have a chance of finding this ship? Better than just a chance. A good one. When people were looking for it, they were searching the sea. I think she came to land. Where? Richard sighed. Somewhere near here. I'm still trying to translate out the book and the stories. It was enough of a lead for me to come here after I'd collaborated some of the information from a few buddies I'd made on the boat ride to Morton's Port. You need time to finish translating it? I wouldn't want to leave before I'm healed anyway, he admitted. We can probably leave 2 weeks from now. That should give him time enough to be well for light travel and searching, especially with Kazunoha with him. He'd have to slow down to her speed for the first few days anyways, before she realized what real travel could be like. Well, that will give me time to find supplies for our trip and whatever else we require. Do we have an accord? He smiled, pushing his empty plate away from him. We do. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to return to my rooms. Being out still tires me out more than I'd like. No problem. Would you like me to write up an agreement and bring it by your rooms on the morrow? Please. We will both need to be able to read it. I read Centaur, Dorani, and Kantuk. He could also read a smattering of other languages, Trill and Govan among them, but he would never be able to check on the wording in those accurately. It was thoughtful of her to offer to write it up. He really was starting to ache. He'd have to drink more of that dratted healing tea when he got back to the inn. Her eyebrows rose at that. Most could only speak one language, 2 at the most. Speaking and reading in just the ones he'd named would be impressive, even if she knew more than one herself. Kantuk, then. Unless you need help returning to your rooms, I'll see you out, and then begin writing it up, and find out when Justice Kilmar will be available to witness the signing for us. I can make it on my own. I'll see you tomorrow, then, partner. He held out his hand, and she clasped it in her own, shaking firmly, a grin lighting her radiant features. Okay, I'll just put the book down here. And that's good. I absolutely love Richard chapters. I've mentioned before that he's very easy to write, since most of the time he's an active character. This chapter is a perfect example of that. Richard is literally planning a treasure hunt, an escape, a decoy escape, and 2 different seductions. And you know just from the way he's talking that he probably has more on the go than just that. Those are just his most pressing concerns. Yep, he's all that and a side of maple syrup. Speaking of which, I wrote the maple syrup in deliberately. Living in Canada, I never really understood why so many people were insane on the stuff. I thought it was like super common everywhere. That is until I was watching an episode of Iron Chef, like the actual Japanese episodes. I can't remember what the main ingredient that week was, but one of the chefs ran over to the table and grabbed some maple syrup to add to one of his dishes. He was using it sparingly as hell, but the show's hosts essentially lost their collective socks when he did it. Such an expense! And I can't believe he just added it to the dish like that. Just, those comments left me so confused. He literally used like a couple of spoonfuls. I've used more than that on my pancakes. And while we didn't have pancakes every week, that was more from preference than from any wish to save money. Fortunately, the internet was a thing, and that led me down a route of figuring out what supply and demand was. While I only grazed the surface of it, and did even less here, I did find it very interesting. That interest is actually part of why I love watching and reading the Spice and Wolf series by Haskuru so much. Getting into the mind of a medieval merchant, with my favorite character, of course, in anime, a wolf girl named Holo. Notice the ears, yes. Is a ride that's fun as hell every time. And I think that's going to be it for this week. If you're proud that I've done my novel, please remember to like the video. If you're feeling especially generous, sharing the video or subscribing would be absolutely incredible as well. Thank you for staying all the way to the end, and I'll see you next week. Bye!